On December 13, 2022, the U.S. Department of Energy held a press conference declaring that in the next 10 years, they aim to supply unlimited clean energy to all Americans. How? By harnessing the same phenomenon that powers the stars, nuclear fusion. But, as Judy Greenwald, Executive Director of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, explains in an April 2023 presentation, this goal is unfortunately not realistic, because it neglects work on the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, an international and intensely collaborative fusion project. As a massive project decades in the making, ITER has garnered substantial media attention, largely because of its role as a symbol of international academic unity. As such, Greenwald argues that before we can make tangible progress in fusion, we need to finish building ITER. Failure to do so would prove that the international community's face of unity is only a facade. So let's analyze fusion and its symbolic role in geopolitics. We'll examine some historical context and the current state of international collaboration and competition in fusion, before finally drawing some implications. Because with our environment in critical danger, those in power want to help, for all the wrong reasons. When we examine the international cooperation in fusion, the historical context is essential. We can divide it into two key phases, pre and post-ITER. Now, first, according to a 1987 analysis by physics historian Paul Foreman, fusion first found momentum in 1968, when the Soviet Union invented the tokamak, the first type of fusion reactor that could be scaled up to a power plant. In a Cold War competitive spark, the US and UK began to upscale the USSR. US domestic funding for fusion increased fivefold in the following decade, and competition motivated these big three to skyrocket their development. Enter none other than President Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. With such neoliberal girl bosses in power, economic tensions with the Soviet Union shifted from militaristic to ideological. A Stanford University analysis of 2021 discovers that in a Reaganomic effort, the US and UK left energy research to the private sector, and they followed the money to oil and gas. Thanks to the neoliberal tenet of minimizing government intervention, the government's interest in funding fusion fell away, no longer motivated by competition with the USSR. But all hope was not lost. Just as our tension shifted, so did the era, into our post-ITER phase. According to ITER policy officer Michael Klesson's 2020 book, ITER, Bringing the Sun to Earth, the idea for ITER was first proposed when Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva in 1983, but the idea struggled to find traction. It took another 5 years for the US, the EU, Russia, and Japan to meet in a committee. And even then, their collaboration was reluctant. Amidst conflict over where to build the machine, each partner researching domestic projects, and financial hesitance from each member, the final design was not finished until 2001. Since then, ITER has onboarded other members, like South Korea, India, and China. Yet progress remains disproportionately slow. Since the beginning, fusion development has been motivated by competition. And while collaboration is terrific in theory, it has been reluctant and even bitter in practice. Now that the stage is set, let's analyze the current state of nuclear politics. ITER today serves as a fascinating case study in international collaboration and competition in two key ways: its rhetoric about itself and how nations actually view the relationship. First, ITER's rhetoric about itself is uplifting, in a way that approaches idealistic. Politico of December 20th, 2022 interviewed Chief ITER engineer Alain Bécoulet. He reveals that after Russia invaded Ukraine, many members questioned its involvement. But they overcame the conflict and Russia still plays a key role in the project. Begole highlights that this reveals the power of ITER's mission: international cooperation in pursuit of a global good, even in the face of political conflict. And this kind of unifying rhetoric is commonplace from ITER, as long as it's convenient. The Russia-Ukraine war has massive international attention. It is hard to ignore. Yet, as a member nation like China sanctions genocide against Uyghurs, ITER remains silent, disrobing their timidity and their idealism, as well as their Eurocentrism. ITER's rhetoric about itself is encouraging, but for how long can they bottle up international tensions? Second, while ITER displays itself as a beacon of collaborative hope, some individual members have far from altruistic motivations. For example, Dr. Scott Su, fusion coordinator for the US Department of Energy, told CBS on October 10th of 2022 that the race to global fusion is also a race to global leadership. America aims to exemplify its status in the forefront of global technology by taking the lead in ITER. And America is making critical contributions to the project, yet in the same breath, Dr. Su adds that America is focusing on public domestic projects to maintain private interest in fusion. This gives America a competitive stance in worldwide fusion, while still upholding Reaganomic values from the 80s. In other words, the US's nuclear priorities are not in ITER and maintaining healthy competition between nations. They are in maintaining the US's global hegemony. ITER may be a project to bring the world clean energy, but for many members, that is far from their primary motivations. And this should come as little surprise, given the historical reluctance and confusion collaboration that we've seen. And given today's seeming facade of fusion collaboration, we must draw two implications for the future of climate change and developing countries' research. Now, first, the image of leadership motivates nations to make good on fusion's environmental promise. Greenwald argues in her aforementioned presentation that we will not have fusion soon enough to prevent climate change, but we can mitigate its effects. For example, American fusion startup Kronos explains on their website that when areas are afflicted by natural disasters, we can restore power by transporting temporary fusion reactors there. In addition, when water insecurity inflates, we can power desalination with fusion. And the nations who seek to appear as tech powerhouses will likely be happy to supply that energy. Perhaps less out of altruism for the planet, and more out of securing their status as technological leaders. The image of leadership may motivate nations in the future to use fusion to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And second, the potential for the developing world to become more involved in international research for a price. I interviewed Dr. Adele Wright, professor of fusion and science diplomacy. She indicates that today the developing world, which often lacks research capital, is becoming more involved in energy research. For example, China is funding Namibia and using abundant Namibian lithium deposits to involve them in energy storage research. And this shows just how gallant and leaderly China is. At least that's what China.org says. Reuters of October 23, 2023 shows that Namibia is indeed more empowered in research, yet China is exploiting their resources, siphoning their precious lithium in a move of neo-colonialism. Dr. Wright argues that when ITER comes online, we will soon see similar collaborations form for fusion, with the same benefits and the same drawbacks. We can only hope that as powerful nations supposedly support the developing world, that they give them their share of fusion energy. Because when climate change burns them the hardest, they need the most healing. Today, we've examined the geopolitics of nuclear fusion, especially in the key case study of ITER. from the historical context, current state, and some implications of international collaboration and competition in fusion, we find that even though fusion research holds so much promise for the environment, many nations act out of image preservation. So the next time we hear of a lofty goal like the US Department of Energy's, we must remember that its motivations may not be what they seem.